A shrill voice pierced the calm, suburban air. "I'm calling 911. This is illegal." Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, stood at the edge of my property, her face red with fury and her phone already pressed to her ear. I didn't flinch. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of rotor blades grew louder as my helicopter descended onto the landing pad I had built on my property, a pad that was not only a symbol of my independence, but also the lifeline of my executive responsibilities. Karen's outburst was as predictable as it was absurd. For years, she had prided herself on enforcing the community's rigid standards, scrutinizing every detail of our pristine neighborhood. But this time, her obsession had taken a dangerous turn. Convinced that the sight of a private helicopter pad was a blatant violation of some obscure HOA regulation, she had dialed 911 without a moment's hesitation. Her voice, filled with self-righteous indignation, echoed across the quiet street as the emergency dispatcher's calm replies could be heard faintly over her frantic tone. As I watched from a distance, the scene unfolding before me was surreal. The police cars and fire trucks began to converge on my property, their sirens wailing in sharp contrast to the stillness of the early evening. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, emerged onto their porches, whispering in disbelief. Little did Karen know that her petty crusade was about to take an unexpected turn, a turn that would expose her overreach and, in a twist of fate, involve someone of national stature. I knew that my helicopter pad was more than just a convenience. It was a symbol of the critical work I did. Unbeknownst to the meddling HOA enforcer, I had recently been appointed as a special advisor to a U.S. senator, a role that demanded mobility and rapid response, often via my personal rotorcraft. The rotor blades grew louder as my chopper touched down on the pad, its landing precise and assured. In that electrifying moment, as Karen continued to shout into her phone, I realized that the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Tonight, her 911 call would come back to haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. Cedar Crest Estates was a neighborhood renowned for its immaculate lawns, identical pastel houses, and an unwavering adherence to a strict set of community standards enforced by a local homeowners association. Every inch of property was subject to rules as detailed as they were inflexible. In this carefully curated environment, individuality was often sacrificed at the altar of uniformity, and no one exemplified that more than Karen Thompson, known throughout the community as HOA Karen. Karen was in her early 50s and possessed an unyielding passion for order. Dressed in crisply ironed suits, her short hair always impeccably styled, she roamed the streets with a clipboard and a smartphone. To her, even the slightest deviation from the established norm was unacceptable. From mismatched flower pots to unconventional architectural details, nothing escaped her hawk-like scrutiny. For years, she had built her reputation on issuing fines and making sure that every resident adhered to the same, unbending standards. I, however, was a stark contrast to the conformity that defined Cedar Crest Estates. Though I had grown up in the community, my path diverged sharply from that of the typical resident. I inherited a modest estate on the edge of the neighborhood, a property that I transformed into both a personal sanctuary and a base of operations for my broader responsibilities. Over the years, I had invested in a state-of-the-art helicopter pad on my land. Not only did it serve as a quick means of transportation for my work as a security consultant and special advisor to a U.S. senator, but it also symbolized my commitment to innovation and individual freedom. My property was a patchwork of modern amenities and rustic charm. A beautifully restored farmhouse, sprawling fields dotted with fruit orchards, and, of course, the helicopter pad, a sleek, concrete landing zone with advanced navigational aids. It was a testament to what could be achieved when tradition met technology. I believed in embracing new ideas and in living life on my own terms, even if that meant standing apart from the rigid expectations of the HOA. Over the years, my farm and the helicopter pad had become a local favorite. Neighbors often admired the practicality of my setup, even if they whispered about it behind closed doors. But Karen's obsession with uniformity meant that nothing was ever acceptable if it didn't fit her narrow definition of perfection. Her repeated fines over everything from the color of my signage to the placement of my garden ornaments were a constant irritation, until she set her sights on my helicopter pad. Her decision to call 911 over a perfectly routine pad test, used by the fire department to check emergency response routes, was the final straw. For Karen, the existence of my pad was a glaring anomaly, a rebellious streak in an otherwise orderly neighborhood. But little did she know that my pad wasn't just a luxury. It was a critical asset, one that had recently taken on even greater significance with my new role as an advisor to a U.S. senator. As dusk turned to evening and the sun began its descent, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose Karen's overreach. My property, with its blend of modern efficiency and rugged individualism, was about to become the backdrop for a showdown that would reverberate throughout Cedar Crest Estates and beyond. And as I prepared to face the consequences of her latest 911 call, I felt a mixture of righteous indignation and anticipation. Tonight, the battle lines between rigid conformity and the freedom to innovate would be drawn in sharp relief. The conflict simmered from the moment Karen's voice rang out over the quiet streets, accusing me of illegal use of my private helicopter pad. The 911 call set off a chain of events that quickly escalated into a full-blown community controversy. Within minutes, police cruisers and fire trucks converged on my property, their flashing lights and blaring sirens a stark counterpoint to the calm that had once defined Cedar Crest Estates. I reviewed the security footage and confirmed that Karen had been stationed at the edge of my property, her expression a mix of anger and self-righteous indignation. Her argument was that my helicopter pad violated some obscure HOA regulation, a regulation she insisted was sacrosanct, even though it had never been enforced before. To her, my pad was not only an eyesore, but a threat to the uniformity and order she so desperately sought to maintain. The footage captured every detail. Karen, phone in hand, gesticulating wildly as she spoke into it, her voice rising above the hum of approaching emergency vehicles. The police arrived and explained that the hydrant test was routine and my pad was clearly marked as private property. But Karen, undeterred by facts, continued to argue that my actions were illegal and disruptive. Neighbors, previously quiet about the strict HOA regulations, began to murmur amongst themselves, and soon the incident was the talk of the community. Social media forums exploded with heated debates. Some sided with Karen's adherence to rules, while others rallied behind my right to innovate and use my property as I saw fit. Frustration and a burning sense of injustice ignited within me. I had always prided myself on following the law and embracing progress. My helicopter pad was a legitimate facility, one that had been approved through proper channels and was vital for my work. Yet Karen's personal vendetta had turned a routine safety test into a spectacle of bureaucratic overreach. It was clear that her motives were less about public safety and more about enforcing a narrow, outdated vision of community aesthetics. Determined to set the record straight, I began compiling all the evidence, time-stamped video clips, digital logs of my pad's usage, and official documents confirming its legitimacy. I reached out to my contacts at the local police department and even my newly appointed senator's office, all of whom assured me that my rights were intact. The more I gathered, the clearer it became. Karen's 911 call was not only baseless, it was a personal attack against my ability to run my operations without interference. At the same time, my recent appointment as a special advisor to a U.S. senator added another layer of complexity. My helicopter pad wasn't just a convenience. It was a critical tool for national-level security and rapid response. The irony of Karen, with her petty sense of order, calling 911 over a pad that was essential for high-level government work, was not lost on the community. As the digital evidence circulated, supportive comments poured in from neighbors and even local officials who recognized the absurdity of the situation. In community forums and on social media, hashtags like hashtag #HelipadHero and hashtag #FreedomToFly began trending. I posted updates explaining that my pad was legally certified, that it had been approved by the relevant authorities, and that its presence was critical for my duties as a state trooper and advisor. My story resonated with many who had long felt stifled by the HOA's rigid enforcement of trivial rules. Karen, for her part, doubled down on her stance, insisting that any violation of the HOA's guidelines was unacceptable. But her claims were steadily being undermined by the overwhelming digital evidence. Every time she attempted to justify her actions, residents countered with facts, videos, and heartfelt testimonials about the importance of individual rights and the role of my helicopter pad in serving a greater purpose. I knew that the conflict was about to reach its boiling point. The HOA board, now under intense pressure from the community and armed with my digital dossier, announced that they would hold a final public hearing to address the incident. The announcement was met with both anticipation and relief by many residents. This hearing promised to be a turning point, a moment when the balance between arbitrary rule enforcement and personal freedom would be finally recalibrated. In the days leading up to the hearing, the digital petitions and online discussions reached a fever pitch. Neighbors organized small rallies, and supportive messages flooded my inbox. It was clear that this was not merely about my helicopter pad or Karen's overreaction. It was about the right of every resident in Cedar Crest Estates to live, work, and innovate without fear of arbitrary interference. The community had spoken, and the call for justice was louder than ever. As the final public hearing drew near, the tension in Cedar Crest Estates reached a fever pitch. Social media was alight with the story. Videos of Karen's furious 911 call, screenshots of my digital evidence, and heartfelt messages of support from neighbors who had long suffered under the HOA's draconian rules. Hashtags like hashtag #HelipadHero, hashtag #FreedomToFly, and hashtag #NoMoreKaren trended locally, and every shared post reinforced the community's determination to stand up against arbitrary enforcement. Local news outlets jumped on the story. Reporters were seen outside my property, capturing the sleek lines of my helicopter pad juxtaposed against the chaotic scene of Karen's relentless attempts to police my property. "It's unbelievable," one anchor commented during a live broadcast, "that a simple safety test could spark such a contentious battle between personal rights and HOA overreach." Interviews with residents revealed a mix of astonishment and admiration for my stance. Many said that they'd grown tired of the constant micromanagement imposed by the HOA, and now a new sense of empowerment was in the air. Inside the HOA board's chambers, heated debates ensued. Emergency meetings were convened in locked rooms, and leaked minutes revealed a deep rift among board members. Some staunchly defended Karen's actions, insisting that strict adherence to the community's guidelines was necessary to preserve property values and order. Others, however, argued that Karen's behavior was an abuse of power, a personal vendetta that had no place in a community that prided itself on fairness and individuality. Our residents deserve to use their property without fear of arbitrary fines and overreaching enforcement. One board member was quoted as saying in a confidential memo, "The internal discord was palpable, and as more digital evidence surfaced, it became clear that the board's authority was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny." I continued to update my online community with every detail of the unfolding drama. I posted live streams from my security cameras, sharing video clips that captured every moment of Karen's 911 call and the subsequent arrival of emergency vehicles. My digital dossier, now bolstered by testimonies from local officials and a statement from the U.S. Senator's office confirming the legality and necessity of my helicopter pad, quickly became the centerpiece of the movement. Neighbors, once hesitant to speak out, flooded community forums with their own stories of arbitrary fines and overzealous enforcement, uniting under the banner of individual rights. Karen, on the other hand, was scrambling to control the narrative. In a series of desperate social media updates, she claimed that her actions were necessary for maintaining community safety. "I was merely protecting our neighborhood from potential dangers," she insisted, her voice wavering as she tried to justify her 911 call. But every attempt to spin her narrative was met with a tidal wave of digital evidence. Proof that my helicopter pad was a fully legal, vital asset for my work as a state trooper and advisor, and that her call was nothing more than a misguided, petty overreaction. The pressure reached its climax when the HOA board announced a final public hearing to resolve the dispute once and for all. The community center was abuzz with anticipation. Flyers were distributed, local radio stations discussed the issue, and the digital petition demanding reform of the HOA's practices garnered tens of thousands of signatures. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the future of property rights and personal freedom in Cedar Crest Estates. On the morning of the hearing, residents poured into the community center. The air was charged with determination, and every whispered conversation, every nod of solidarity, reinforced the idea that the time for change had come. The digital dossier, meticulously compiled and shared with every available platform, served as an unassailable record of the absurdity of Karen's actions. Every shared video clip and every hashtag was a clarion call to the HOA board. Respect our rights or face the consequences. As the final hour ticked away, the tension was palpable. The community's voices, amplified by social media and local media coverage, formed a united front that could not be ignored. This was not merely a dispute over a helicopter pad or a 911 call. It was a battle for the very soul of Cedar Crest Estates, a fight to reclaim our right to live, work, and innovate without arbitrary interference. The decisive moment came on a crisp morning in a packed boardroom at the Cedar Crest Estates Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and a sea of determined residents, all gathered to witness the final public hearing that would set the future course of our neighborhood's policies. With calm authority and unyielding resolve, Councilwoman Denise Matthews stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the collective determination of a community that had grown tired of arbitrary rule enforcement. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed official records, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Matthews began, her voice clear and resolute. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Miller, specifically her decision to call 911 over my legally certified helicopter pad, were not motivated by genuine concern for public safety, but were driven solely by personal bias and an abuse of power. Our community's rights, particularly the right to use our own property without fear of baseless interference, must be upheld. A heavy silence fell over the room as Matthews continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all sanctions imposed in connection with this incident. Furthermore, we will launch a comprehensive disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an overreach to occur, and we will implement new guidelines that protect the rights of every resident to manage their property as they see fit. Today's decision is not merely about reversing an unjust 911 call. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Crest Estates will stand for fairness, accountability, and the inalienable right to live and work without arbitrary interference. Her words resonated powerfully. A well-respected community advocate, known for his tireless defense of individual liberties, rose to speak next. Today, we stand united, he declared, his voice echoing through the room. No resident should have their ability to innovate or protect their property compromised by the petty whims of an overzealous enforcer. Let this vote mark the turning point, a clear signal that our community values truth and rational governance above all. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our rights is met with swift, decisive action. Thunderous applause filled the room, affirming the collective resolve of every resident present. Following his address, a senior officer from the local public safety department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all evidence confirming the legality of my helicopter pad and debunking every claim made by Karen Miller. The dossier included expert testimonies, official certifications, and a full account of my property's legal status. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures for any abuse of power, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Matthews concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Crest Estates, a community where individual rights are respected and public authority is exercised with integrity. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, regardless of how self-righteous, can impose their personal vendettas on our community. Together, we stand for justice, transparency, and the inalienable right to live freely on our own property." Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights and personal freedom. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the united voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Crest Estates. The days of petty interference and baseless fines were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks following the historic vote, Cedar Crest Estates underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded sanctions and the sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and social networks, sparking fervent debates about property rights, individual freedom, and the proper role of community governance. Editorials in the local newspaper, bearing headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Crest" and "Community United for Freedom," celebrated the decisive action taken to protect every resident's right to innovate and manage their own property without fear of arbitrary interference. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOBullying, and #InnovationWins trended widely, reinforcing our collective determination to stand up against bureaucratic overreach. Town hall meetings and community forums saw unprecedented attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and envision a future where personal expression and innovation were not only tolerated but celebrated. Neighbors who had long lived under the oppressive grip of strict HOA rules now spoke openly about their right to live on their own terms. "Our land is our legacy, and it belongs to us alone," one impassioned resident declared, his voice resonating through the crowded meeting hall. The atmosphere was electric with hope, a promise that Cedar Crest Estates would always safeguard the freedoms of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical governance, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was thoroughly reviewed and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary fines or invasive interference. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed at a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our renewed commitment to justice and fairness. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to further empower residents. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about property rights and the importance of creative freedom in shaping our community's future. When we stand together, our voices have the power to transform even the most outdated systems, a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to unite in the fight for a more inclusive and equitable governance model. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to stand up against HOA Karen's arbitrary fines and to reclaim my right to operate my farm stand, through the audacious act of buying the very grocery store she depended on, had not only restored my personal freedoms, but had ignited a movement that resonated throughout Cedar Crest Estates. Neighbors, once silenced by fear of punitive measures, found their voices and shared their own stories of resistance. The digital evidence that exposed Karen's misdeeds became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to innovate without constraint. Karen Miller, once the formidable enforcer of the HOA's draconian rules, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community unites for justice. Her influence waned rapidly, and digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for reform and the dangers of unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Crest Estates, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered beneath the warm glow of a setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights," was unfurled between towering oak trees, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate our victory over arbitrary interference, a victory for every homeowner and every creative spirit in our community, Councilwoman Matthews proclaimed, her voice filled with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our freedoms and ensure that no one can abuse public power again. As each new day dawned over Cedar Crest Estates, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen's baseless interference with my property rights was met with a bold, decisive response, one that reclaimed my farm stand and, in a twist of fate, turned the tables on the very enforcer of conformity, became a rallying cry for every resident. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Crest Estates, truth, justice, and the right to innovate would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Crest Estates would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for individual property shone as brightly as the dawn.